Let's go ahead and dive into behavioral challenges. So when we look into school-wide behavioral systems, how do you create school-wide behavioral support systems that address the needs of students with significant behavioral challenges while maintaining a positive learning environment?
Loaded question, Martha.
Yeah.
Very big question.
Uh, I think this like goes back to what Glennis was just talking about in terms of like a school-wide approach and a school-wide sort of change management or understanding of what kids need and why. I see so many stories where, you know, kids are really in crisis during the school day, and it can be extraordinarily disruptive. And as a special education person, you're navigating, leadership that is trying to maintain learning in the classroom. You're also trying to manage potentially parent expectations and things that other kids are hearing outside of, stories that are getting home. But you're also trying to do the right thing for that particular student, meet their needs, keep them in gen ed as much as possible. So it is very, very challenging out there right now. And there isn't like an answer. There isn't like the right way to do it. But I think it starts with understanding as a staff that, you know, there is a hierarchy of needs for students, um, and that they're not going to be able to meet your expectations unless they are getting certain of their needs met in terms of feeling safe. And so a lot of times what I see is people prioritizing like compliance over getting supporting the student to feel safe. And that might mean like prolonging, access to academics or deprioritizing academics until you can get to that place with a student. Those are not systems necessarily, but it is kind of a mindset about how to approach behaviors, and an understanding that the more our community doesn't understand that different kids need different things, and that trying to think how to say this, like if people don't understand that different kids need different things and that we need to adjust expectations at certain times in order to meet those needs, then we're going to have a lot of power struggles, and we're going to have um, a lot of behaviors, and that we can sort of predict that based on sort of the level of inclusivity, the level of understanding of different needs and disabilities, and sort of how that can play out in the classroom. I think you can I can hear teachers talk and predict that they're going to have a lot of behavior challenges in their classrooms, um, because they have very rigid expectations. And our kids these days, they're not responding to that right now. And so it's a very delicate dance, I think. Um, yeah, I'm sure you're seeing that just a ton, Glennis. I'd love to hear how you're thinking about that and what kinds of things you're doing in schools.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you just said and a lot of what we were talking about before is I think really this like tier one and this targeted universalism as the same approach we take with behavior, right? We know every year there's going to be kids that don't meet where we want them to meet right now for behavior for whatever reason. And we're able to anticipate a lot of those things. Are there certain cases where kids are really going through a different level of need that we really need to get creative around? Absolutely. But there are a lot of common behavioral challenges that are becoming more and more frustrating for folks that we can anticipate are a need, right? So I work in a lot of schools where like eloping is a really big issue, right? Kids just leave class when they're unhappy. Well, that's a response to to either, a variety of different things. It's a response to, I don't want to do this work, right? It's too hard, I'm not interested, so I'm going to leave. I'm unhappy about something in this space, right? I don't feel safe. I don't feel supported. I don't want to be here for whatever reason, and we leave. Or doesn't understand how to manage my emotions right now. I am upset about something and I'm not sure how to communicate that. And the only way I know how to get out of this is to flee, is to leave this space, right? So that's a common behavior we deal with a lot. And I think really deeply understanding like that is, if that is in your school system, like that's something we need to start to think about is like, why are kids leaving? What are the reasons this happens? Is this a specific student, specific classroom? Where is it happening? So we can better understand how do we support our students in having better coping strategies to navigate those situations. If it's things like talking out in class or using profanity, we deal with that one a lot too. Like what is the purpose of that use so we're able to better understand? And I think people really understanding how behavior works, I think is also an area, a gap that we have is how behavior works, how behavior is a form of communication for many children. They're telling you something, might not be the way you want them to tell you, but they're telling you something. How do we help provide them with the skills needed to navigate these situations better? I think is still a large need. And I think really thinking about that up front before the year starts, thinking about how do we know last year, these incidents always showed up. Cool. What are we going to do as a response to this? And I think not a response as like, what's the consequence? Because I think that's often where we go to as a system is we're like, what are the universal consequences and rewards versus being like, okay, what does this group of students or specific student need to learn skill-wise in order to prevent this from happening? And is it at a large enough level, it needs to be a tier 1 thing that's taught across the grade level, across the campus? Or is this a tier 2 situation? We've got this group of kids, this is the need. We're going to do a social skills group for 6 weeks and work on this specific skill set for how do we navigate our emotions when we want to walk out of class? How do we stay in that space? How do we get our feelings met without just leaving and being a safety issue? So I think that there's just a lot of work that needs to be done about like why behavior exists. And I think to Ingrid's point, I think there's still some folks out there that really approach behavior with a, well, you didn't listen to me, so this is my rule and this is the consequence, instead of understanding what kids are trying to tell you. And I think in our generation that's upcoming, we have a lot of kids that are being parented from a gentle parenting perspective, from a different approach that they're not going to respond that same way that maybe you responded to when you were a kid. And so I think that those are things to also understand as the generation we have in front of us is different. They're affected by technology differently. Parenting is different right now. And so understanding what works for kids, I think is something that we deeply need to better understand. And what I would encourage folks to think about is just because it was different when you were a kid doesn't mean that that's going to apply right now to our kids. Even if it feels frustrating, there are different ways now that we need to address how kids are being told how to do things. If you have a kid who's being gentle parented, parents are in a more understanding place of understanding what the behavior is. They're trying to understand why the kid is doing X, Y, and Z. So then they come to your classroom and they're met with, no, don't do this. You're going to meet some resistance. So there are things just to better understand. And I think that's also where parent collaboration comes in with behavior, is understanding who is your kid at home, right? Who is the kid at home? How does mom and dad parent? What are their priorities for their children? Or if they live with grandma or whoever they live with, like what does that look like at home? Because at home, that's what they're experiencing on a regular basis. And so I think that helps us better understand like what is normal, what is their not normal, but like what are they used to? So you can understand kind of and align with families on what expectations are. I think that's a missed opportunity a lot, is to better understand like what are the priorities at home that the kids are seeing on a regular basis. Because parenting is different now. It is. And I think we need to adapt with it instead of fighting against it. Sorry,
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah. And I think to that, Ingrid, you mentioned something pretty eye-opening. You said that oftentimes you notice that there's a prioritizing of compliance over ensuring the student feels safe. Do you mind expanding on what you mean by safe?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I often think about how it feels to be a kid with a disability in one of the classrooms that I see. And I try to think about what would I do if I was, that kid in that situation. And a lot of times, we're asking our kids to exhibit like an extraordinary level of resilience that we as adults don't actually demonstrate. um, so, we're asking kids to do things like read aloud when they are not, fluent readers. We're asking kids to sit still. We're asking kids to do things that they might, you know, and my experience with kids with disabilities is they are incredibly resilient. In one of the schools that I worked at, we did some research on um, attendance rates. And it was really fascinating. Over the course of the year, students with disabilities, their attendance decreased over time. But at the beginning of the year, they my interpretation of this data was like they were really hopeful coming into a new school year, starting fresh. And as soon as they started to feel like it's just going to be the same thing again, where I feel like I can't keep up, like I don't feel like like I'm being punished for being behind. As soon as those feelings start to hit, people start disinvesting in school. And it's not very fun to feel like a failure at school. And we are constantly sending these kids messages about their abilities, their, the way that we grade things, the way that we approach them, the way that we interact with them. um you'll see kids, I've seen it before, where a kid comes in and is doing trying to start fresh, and teachers have heard the stories and they're all ready to show this kid who's boss, and all of a sudden the kid's right back to the narrative that they experienced in years prior, and they don't get that fresh start. And so I see so many kids that really don't feel like they can be, like they don't feel okay to be where they're at in terms of their abilities, in terms of where they struggle. And their teachers don't always make them feel like they're safe to try to experiment. And that's going to impact a kid and have really long-term impacts, I think, over the course of a kid's school experience. It can become such a negative place to be, if you're working with teachers or other adults that don't understand you. And I just often think about how we as adults, what we do when we're faced with those situations, and we're taught to like set boundaries and like do all of these things that if you did that in a school setting, right, you're a behavior, you're a behavior challenge, because you're trying to protect yourself, right? And so all of the things that Glynis was talking about, behavior as communication, a lot of it I find is kids don't feel safe and they're trying to protect themselves, and how that manifests is in a lot of ways that we interpret as challenging behaviors.